Hey guys, Ryan here, and this is a Patreon Unlock episode where we're making a handful of our exclusive Patreon and Apple Premium bonus episodes available to everyone. This is just a small portion of what we offer if you decide to join. You also get priority to ask our guests your listener questions, and you get early access to all the main shows. So if you'd like to join, head on over to patreon.com/somewhereskies. Or click the subscribe button at the top of your Apple Podcast feed to become an Apple Premium subscriber. Both of these give you the same rewards. Again, that's patreon.com/somewhereskies, or click the subscribe button over on Apple. Thank you to all past, present, and hopefully you included, future Patreon supporters. Enjoy. Although it's little known outside of the Netherlands, and while it's a sighting that lasted only minutes, a UFO encounter over Soesterberg Air Force Base in early 1979 is one of the most interesting on record, not least because of the investigation by UFO groups in the months that followed. It was later determined by investigators that 2 flybys over the base had taken place that evening, and that multiple witnesses had viewed the encounters from various vantage points and locations around the base. Despite the military's attempts to dismiss the sighting as nothing more than a mirage or optical illusion, it appears clear that the incident is most definitely a sighting of something very real. It's also a clear and multi-witness sighting of a black triangle, a decade before the Belgian wave sightings of almost identical craft, which sparked regular sightings of these triangular objects around the world. And not just the dimensions and descriptions of the object, but its behavior also mirrored many of those future encounters. Indeed, the UFO event over Soesterberg Air Force Base on that bitterly cold morning just might be one of the earliest multi-witness black triangle sightings on record.
Greetings. You have been granted top secret access to the following content. It is for your ears and eyes only. Thank you for your cooperation.
The incident over Soesterberg Air Force Base began at 5:45 a.m. on February 3, 1979, when 3 bright lights appeared in formation overhead. According to reports, the lights were first noticed by several on-duty security guards. They quickly radioed the sighting in, asking for all available personnel to make their way outside. In total, 12 military guards looked on in shock, noting that the 3 lights were the underside of a large triangular object. As well as the 3 white lights, a single red light in the middle of the underside appeared to be beam-like in nature. The object was at a relatively low altitude, approximately 500 to 600 feet above the ground. So low that the lights lit up the ground below. Even stranger, despite its size, the object moved in complete silence. The craft remained in sight for around 5 minutes before disappearing into the distance. One of the soldiers present that morning was Commander Van Vliet. He later recalled that his initial reaction was that the object was nothing but an airplane. However, as the object descended somewhat, he noticed that it produced no sound at all. And despite its large size, it was flying at a particularly slow speed, and there was something unnatural about the lighting, with Vliet elaborating that the light came from some kind of tube. It was now clear to Van Vliet that whatever the object was, it most definitely wasn't an airplane. Again, the object remained in sight for around 5 minutes, during which time all radios and communication at the base suddenly cut out. When the triangular object eventually disappeared into the distance, communication suddenly returned. There was an immediate buzz around the base as personnel communicated with each other looking to see if they had witnessed the curious craft also. And while the military did their best to contain talk of the incident to the confines of the base, the general excitement about the sighting was so great that word eventually reached UFO investigators, who then approached the Air Force in April of 1979, looking for an explanation for the bizarre events that cold morning. Investigators would soon discover that 2 sets of lights were witnessed over the base on the morning in question, and these lights were witnessed from 5 different locations around the base. According to investigators, the incident began when the guards first noticed the lights overhead. This sighting came from a location at the west part of the base, or Post A. As the object approached, the lights shined down toward the ground, at one point almost trapping the men in the beam. At the same time, from the northeast part of the base, or Post B, the same object was also witnessed. From the angle the witnesses saw the object, they could see the beams of light cast diagonally toward the ground. The object remained visible for a short time only. When investigators examined the details of the sightings from each location, they could determine much more confidently that the object was around 600 feet from the ground and was traveling at approximately 30 to 60 miles per hour. Investigators suggested that shortly after the first sighting, a second flyover, whether of the same object or a second one, took place. And this one was witnessed by a third location, or Post C. However, because of their locations, the witnesses at Post C only saw the object very briefly, and even then only saw lights. In fact, they were so unimpressed by what they had seen that they didn't even see a reason to report it at the time. But a very short time after that, at Post D, personnel, now alerted to the object's apparent presence by those at Post A, were surveying their surroundings, unable to see anything out of the ordinary. However, after continuing to scan the skies above for a few moments longer, they soon saw the 3 lights approaching from the direction of Post C. They noted that the middle light appeared to be slightly higher than the light on each side. Those at Post D would later state that there was something strange about the lights and that you could look directly into them without experiencing any glare, unlike when looking directly into car headlights, for example. The witnesses estimated they were approximately 300 feet from the object, which was at an altitude of around 150 feet. As the object passed overhead, the red light became visible to the witnesses, with a beam coming from it that appeared to be pointing straight down. They watched as the object headed in the distance to the south, passing over the edge of the nearby woods. The object remained in their sight, and they could all see the beam of the light stretching down to the ground as it moved. Then, without warning, a bright flash of light came, and at the same time, the white lights went out. The red light was still vaguely visible as the object sped off into the distance with increasing speed. As the witnesses at Post D were watching the aerial display, at the southwest of the base, Post E, the witnesses could see the lights of the object approaching them. Only moments after first seeing its approach, the flash of light lit up the sky temporarily, and the white lights went out as the object made its way away from the base. And with that, the events seemed to be over. But another incident unfolded around a month later, on March 2nd, 1979, over Camp New Amsterdam, the American part of the base. And once more, multiple people witnessed the events. So much so that the Dutch government even began to ask questions of the military. In response, the military offered that what had been witnessed on both occasions was simply a mirage. Essentially, the military argued that car headlights reflecting against a reflective layer of air had caused the lights to appear overhead. Needless to say, the witnesses to the events that evening, as well as investigators of the case, certainly didn't buy into the official military explanation. Eventually, investigators reconstructed the events that morning, with 10 of the 12 witnesses participating. It was largely because of this reconstruction that a fuller timeline of the events emerged. Essentially, despite the official military explanation, it would appear that whatever was witnessed over the base that evening was so much more than a mirage. There's also another crucial detail to explore with this case. A nuclear one. According to some reports, some of the witnesses saw the red beam of light project down towards a bunker that was rumored to house nuclear weapons for the United States military. Some suggest that it was the presence of these weapons that attracted the triangular-shaped UFO in the first place, and that its mission was to examine or possibly even disable the weapons in question. It's interesting to note that this behavior from strange aerial objects has been reported several times during the Cold War, perhaps most notably during the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, which occurred in the United Kingdom just short of a year later in December of 1980. Whether the red beam of light detail and the nuclear connection is accurate or not remains open to debate. However, it is interesting to note that in January of 2021, it was revealed in an article in the Dutch publication Volkskrant that nuclear weapons were indeed stored at the facility. Furthermore, when investigators looked at this detail, they highlighted that there are around 15, quote, igloo bunkers that are generally used to house explosive materials. One of these, known as Object 194, is slightly separated from the rest of these bunkers and appears to have a much sturdier exterior, very similar to other known nuclear weapons bunkers around Europe. The Soesterberg Air Force Base UFO encounter is an interesting case for several reasons, not least the apparent desire of the Dutch military to keep the encounter away from the general public. However, because of the work of UFO investigators in the months that followed, as well as establishing a timeline of events, several details of the craft also emerged. For example, while most at the time agreed the shape of the object was triangular, and the arrangement of the lights most certainly was triangular in shape, when it came to light that some of the witnesses recalled connecting structures in between the lights, it appeared that the dimensions of the object were more kite-shaped or possibly even rectangular. Furthermore, the red light appeared to be set further back than in the middle of the white lights, appearing to be in the middle of the back two white orbs. The lights themselves appeared to be tens of feet in diameter, and while the white lights seemingly had the ability to point forward diagonally, the red light appeared to only point directly towards the ground. Investigators also noted the sincerity of the witnesses, stressing how their reactions were a mixture of fear and controlled restraint at endorsing what they had seen as a vehicle from another world, through being aware of the possible ridicule that they would face. This suggested that the soldiers had seen something very real, and that there was no sign of a hoax or that it was a practical joke of any kind. The UFO encounter over Soesterberg Air Force Base in February of 1979 is a very important case. Was this an early encounter with the almost identical black triangles that would be witnessed during the wave of sightings over Belgium, which incidentally borders the Netherlands? And is the location important? Although the sightings of black triangular aircraft have been witnessed regularly in the United States since the 1980s, it is interesting that such a sighting should occur so close to the Belgian wave encounters. If we take the hotspot areas of the United States into account, could it be that the access to these areas from the oceans, or North Sea in the case of Northwest Europe, is also of importance? Might these regions see more of these strange triangular objects? simply because they are using the world's waterways to maybe transverse the planet, or perhaps even emerge from an underwater base. While this may sound preposterous to some, it is a conclusion that some UFO researchers are seriously contemplating. And what about the nuclear angle to all of this? We all but know that nuclear weapons were almost certainly stored at the base at the time of the sightings. Could it really have been their presence that attracted this mysterious triangle? And if so, for what purpose? Was it merely a reconnaissance mission, or could it really be that the weapons were somehow disabled? After all, the military would hardly make such an incident public knowledge. To do so would be to admit the incident happened in the first place. We might also argue that the object was definitely not an alien vehicle from another world, but a highly advanced experimental aircraft, perhaps from the American military bases in Europe, or even one that belonged to the Soviet authorities. While this might seem unlikely to some, it is certainly not that much of a stretch of the imagination, and might explain why authorities look to distance themselves from the encounter. Ultimately, the UFO incident over Soesterberg Air Force Base likely has many more details to reveal itself over 4 decades after it unfolded. What those details might be, however, remain somewhere in the skies. In the mid-1970s, a Japanese farmer awoke from a deep sleep. There was a loud pounding on his front door. What he saw when he opened the door would change his life forever.
Greetings. You have been granted top secret access to the following content. It is for your ears and eyes only. Thank you for your cooperation.
28-year-old vegetable farmer Yoshihiro Fujiwara was a hard-working man of the land. By all accounts, his only concerns regarding what came from the skies involved the sun, rain, or whatever else might affect his crops, and therefore his livelihood. It was April 6, 1974, at approximately 3 a.m. in Kitami City in Hokkaido. Yoshihiro, fast asleep, suddenly awoke to the sounds of his wildly barking guard dog, followed by a rapid series of knocks emanating from his front door. Exhausted and more than likely irritated by this unsolicited interruption, Yoshihiro pulled himself up and trudged over the neatly stacked shoes in his genkan, the traditional Japanese entryway, and placed his hand on the doorknob. He flung the door open, fully intending to give this uninvited knocker a piece of his mind. But his anger at the situation instantly shifted to pure terror at what he saw in front of him. Standing on the farmer's doorstep, illuminated only by the moonlight, was a bizarre creature that stood about 3 feet tall, quasi-humanoid looking, and clad in a clear vinyl outfit. According to Yoshihiro, it resembled a curious combination of a starfish and an octopus. It had a large, bulbous, octopoidal head with a pair of menacing-looking, downward slanting eyes, and what seemed to be a single V-shaped nostril. The creature's mouth was wide, and it appeared to be grinning. Yoshihiro glanced downward. He noted that the being stood bipedally on 2 of its 4 starfish-like limbs, all of which tapered to rounded nubs. Its torso seemed to be a modest affair, more akin to a fleshy hub in the center of its body from which its limbs seemed to sprout out in multiple directions. The creature wore a bluish, conical helmet from which a relatively small antenna emerged from the apex. The antenna was capped by an elliptical disc that emitted odd bursts of visibly undulating electricity that seemed to ripple over the being. Its plastic-shrouded skin appeared to be brownish and bumpy, not unlike the flesh of a common toad. However, unlike a toad, was the vicious sheen of slime that covered its skin. The flesh was mottled with what looked to be a series of lumpy, almost freckle-like blue and yellow lesions and scabs. As Yoshihiro stood dumbfounded, the creature stuck one of its flesh appendages skyward, and suddenly, Yoshihiro's home was consumed by an unbearably hot beam of orange light. The justifiably terrified farmer quickly retreated from his front door and scurried to his bedroom. Through his open window, he could see that the source of the odd illumination was a flying saucer, approximately 5 feet in height and around 26 feet in diameter. The saucer was floating about 70 feet off the ground in a field adjacent to his home, and according to him, it seemed to be emitting rays of orange color. As if all of this wasn't disturbing enough, Yoshihiro suddenly felt a warm gust of air surge around his feet, and within moments, he found himself being drawn towards his window by some sort of invisible force. He tried to stay planted on the ground, but the force was too strong, pulling him out of the window towards the waiting saucer. Just as Yoshihiro braced himself for impact with the outer shell of the craft, he realized, much to his surprise, that he was being absorbed through the hull of the saucer. Once inside, he did his best to assess his surroundings. He raised his head off the floor and noted that the compartment he was in was parallel-piped in shape and blue in color. He saw weird lamp-like attachments on the walls, as well as air vents and a large sign with writing that looked vaguely Japanese, but proved to be illegible. Yoshihiro found himself suddenly overwhelmed by a noxious scent that made him queasy. And that's when he noticed a pair of plastic-clad octopoidal entities identical to the one on his doorstep, now standing above him. The panicked farmer started to push himself up, but the creatures managed to hold him down. As frightening as their actions seemed to be, Yoshihiro claimed that they were attempting to calm him by means of telepathic communication. Their message was simple and came with a pledge.
No danger. We promise to release you close to your house.
Despite their promises of safety and, hopefully, release, Yoshihiro was not to be placated. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, he managed to wrench himself away from the abductors and ran blindly until he spied a partially open hatch. Terrified, Yoshihiro threw himself through the opening, and through sheer dumb luck, or perhaps at the merciful hand of the creatures, the flying saucer had descended to just 10 feet off the ground. He hit the cold grass with a dull thud, but he pushed the pain aside and scrambled to his feet in a desperate attempt to escape his captors. Yoshihiro sprinted away from the hovering orange craft towards a nearby house, pounding on their door, just as his captors had done to him. The clearly startled homeowners cautiously peeked outside and recognized the wide-eyed Yoshihiro as the farmer who lived less than 2 miles away. Almost certainly as scared as they were concerned, the neighbors did let him inside. It was then that he realized that although the horrific ordeal had seemed to last only a matter of minutes, over an hour and a half had elapsed since he had been sucked out of his home and brought aboard the craft. After explaining the ordeal to the homeowners, they politely listened, tried to calm him down, and soon sent him on his way, most likely hoping they'd never see the crazy farmer again. Yoshihiro, frazzled and exhausted, made his way back home, laid in bed, and tried as he might to go to sleep. Though no one else claimed to have seen the craft, less than 24 hours later, Yoshihiro began to feel bursts of excruciating pain in his ears. This was followed by an intense burning sensation in his fingertips. It was then that he grabbed a pencil and some scrap paper and, suddenly feeling a strong impulse, began to write. Yoshihiro fell into what he called an unconscious or trance-like state and began to draw a series of strange and, to him at least, incomprehensible hieroglyphics. It was then that a booming voice exploded in his head, and it made the following command.
When the disc lands on the mountain, you will come and board by yourself.
Whether inspired by compulsion or mere curiosity, Yoshihiro followed the voice's orders, and on April 8th, he and two of his friends made out for nearby Nikoro Mountain. They arrived at 6:30 p.m., and, as per the instructions, Yoshihiro left his compatriots behind and ascended the peak alone. After reaching the designated area, Yoshihiro was greeted by the same, or identical, orange-illuminated saucer. This time, he boarded without a fight, drawn by some sort of psychic pull. Once aboard, Yoshihiro was treated to a trip. According to him, the pilot creatures gave him a guided tour of near space, flying around the moon once and the Earth twice. The journey took about an hour and a half to complete. Afterwards, Yoshihiro was returned to the designated location on Nikoro Mountain, where he promptly collapsed. It's difficult to ascertain whether he was simply overwhelmed by the fatigue that would surely have taken its toll following the intensity of his experiences, both physically and clearly psychologically, over the last 24 hours, or if something on the ship adversely affected him. Either way, he was found unconscious by his friends. They were able to carry him and take him home. It took Yoshihiro days to recover from this harrowing ordeal. During his recovery, he realized that he had in fact developed psychic abilities. He found that he was not only able to communicate with the ostensibly alien beings that had so diligently pursued him, but he also displayed telekinetic skills. He tested this realization by bending small pieces of metal with his mind. On April 13th, the plastic-wrapped aliens invited Yoshihiro to go on one final astonishing trip. Once again, the farmer was taken aboard the luminous craft. Yoshihiro and his extraterrestrial hosts flew past Mars toward the middle portion of our solar system, where he was then treated to a sight never before seen by human eyes. There in front of him was the storm-ridden behemoth we know as Jupiter. Yoshihiro stared in awe at the incredible gas giant. But the next phase of the journey would prove to be even more astounding, and when all was said and done, controversial. The strange starfish-like navigators then left Jupiter's orbit and landed on Saturn's largest moon, the densely atmospheric Titan. One of the creatures disembarked from the vehicle and retrieved a rock from the moon's surface. This object was presented to Yoshihiro as a memento of the voyage. Excited to finally have confirmation of this increasingly bizarre encounter, Yoshihiro wasted no time in delivering this extraplanetary artifact to scientists at the laboratory of the University of Studies of Engineering in Katami. The group of scientists ran a series of tests on the rock, and much to the farmer's shock and dismay, came the conclusion that the rock was nothing more than a chunk of stalactite from a local Katami cave. Dejected, Yoshihiro took his rock and sauntered off like Charlie Brown. Already the source of neighborhood and, after the press got a hold of the story, nationwide ridicule, one would assume that Yoshihiro might become reclusive and try to avoid any sort of public scrutiny, but it seems that the once simple farmer chose a rather different path. Although the visitations had stopped, Yoshihiro claimed to have maintained a seemingly continuous dialogue with the starfish-like creatures. he began to refer to himself as the spokesperson for the Summon Call Space Union, or SumCall for short. Although he failed to elaborate on who or what was summoned, or for what purpose they or he might be called. So yeah. In any event, Yoshihiro claimed to have focused his newfound psychic abilities, which had evidently evolved far beyond the mere bending of metal, on teleporting over immense distances and even preventing catastrophic natural disasters. He would go on to state that he could teleport to a star 250 million light years away, and he could do this in 6 minutes. He would also say that his role was to delay natural disasters, such as earthquakes and volcano eruptions. Despite his newfound teleportation skills, Yoshihiro further claimed that he had constant access to no less than 3 flying saucers. He would state that he had them hidden deep in the mountain of Hidaka. Yoshihiro would claim that these flying saucers enabled him to stop volcanic eruptions by allowing him to travel inside the hollow earth, where he was able to prevent the flow of magma from going topside. He could do this by stuffing rocks inside the volcano's inner channels. Whether he did this by using the flying saucer's technology, his Professor X-like psychic abilities, or some combination of both, is just one of the many mysteries surrounding the astonishing Yoshihiro Fujiwara that needs to be answered. Answers that the vegetable farmer claims to have, but answers we continue to search for somewhere in the skies. In 1971, a group of Girl Guides, or what those in the United States would most likely consider Girl Scouts, were camping on the outskirts of a small town called Hambleton in the south of England. It was a mildly warm evening as the girls and their camp leaders prepared to settle in for the night. But something would happen that would interrupt their soon-to-be bedtime, and that something would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is the Hambleton Girl Guides UFO encounter.
Greetings. You have been granted top secret access to the following content. It is for your ears and eyes only. Thank you for your cooperation.
The strange and intriguing events unfolded during one evening in early August of 1971. Girl Guide leader Olive Granger would speak to the news a short time later about the event. She would offer that the leaders of the group were enjoying a last cup of cocoa around the campfire while the rest of the guides were in bed. She stated that there was a sudden terrific roar which caused them to look up. When they did so, they saw a straight line with flashing lights that was heading straight towards them, causing them to duck as they anticipated this mysterious object was going to crash into them. At the very last moment, though, it swerved and went into a field where they had set up their camp. They estimated that the object was around 50 yards away. At this point, another of the camp leaders, one Miss Hare, had joined them, as had 2 of the Girl Guides, who had been alerted due to the commotion outside. The small group simply stood there in shock, as the object was now hovering in front and above them. Granger would respond when she first saw the object that she thought it was an aircraft out of control, and that she thought it was going to land on the campsite. She stated that aside from the roaring noise, there were no other sounds whatsoever. In short, they all suddenly found themselves in a very bizarre situation. Local news reporters would ask Granger that once they had a good chance to look at the object, what shape it was. Granger responded that it seemed to be circular in shape, adding that they didn't see all around it, and just saw one side of it. She also added that the object didn't appear to have any sort of wings or appendages at all, pretty much confirming that whatever it wasn't an airplane. Granger was sure of that. After several moments, Miss Hare suggested that they approach the object so that they could get a closer look. However, Granger, as well as the other camp leader, one Mrs. McCann, decided otherwise, both terrified and frightened of what they were seeing. Instead of approaching the object, the witnesses decided to try and phone the manor, which was the main building of the land they were camping on. But they soon realized it was much too late, and they didn't wish to disturb the landowner. Nor did they wish to frighten them by informing them of the bizarre and strange object on their property. Although they realized that they were definitely seeing something unusual, none of the women were sure exactly who they should contact. Instead, they watched the object for a short time longer. Granger would reiterate that whatever the object was, they were all sure that it wasn't an airplane or any type of conventional aircraft, adding that it was either something from outer space or it was something that was being developed and being kept hush-hush, and that these leaders were definitely not meant to see this. Granger stated that when the object was in the field, it wasn't very high at all. In fact, it was quite close to the ground, approximately 30 feet in the air, at best. When it was moving directly over them, however, it was much higher up, at least as high as a standard 2-story house. Granger further offered that the subject of flying saucers was not something that she had devoted any significant thought to. Although she was aware of some of the reports from around the world, she never believed she would find herself in the middle of such an event. Just what the Girl Guide leaders and 2 girl guides witnessed that evening remains a mystery. However, their descriptions of the object, while perhaps basic, is certainly compelling. In fact, it is perhaps the lack of intricate detail that makes this sighting so credible. As it is, all that these multiple witnesses tell us is that a strange object with multiple lights approached them from a nearby field and hovered above them for several minutes before disappearing again. In short, we should take this incident as an aerial object that was most definitely out of the ordinary. The sighting in Hambleton is another example of everyday witnesses seeing something unusual and reporting on those events. It is down to those of us who are open-minded enough to contemplate their account to ensure that it isn't forgotten, and that one day, as other sightings and encounters are studied and even perhaps solved, answers may surface to both those and the Hambleton account. For now, though, it is another report on the ever-growing pile of similar reports of strange, otherworldly craft visiting our planet. Here is the actual news report with the witnesses of the Hambleton Girl Guide's UFO sighting.
Since last week's report by 2 Aldridge policemen that they saw an unidentified flying object, hundreds of viewers have written or phoned to say that they'd seen similar things. One of the most interesting reports came from a Girl Guides camp near Droitwich. They were camped next to the field in which I'm standing, and they say that they saw what they think was a flying saucer hovering over this field for nearly an hour. Mrs. Olive Granger was one of the guide leaders.
Mrs. McGowan, she's the guide at Fort Dudley. We were having a last cup of cocoa round the campfire in the kitchen. The guides were in bed, and suddenly there was this terrific roar. And we looked up, and the shape, it seemed to be just a straight line with flashing lights, was coming towards us. We ducked, and this thing swerved and went into the meadow, the next meadow, which is about 50 yards away from where we were. And by this time, Miss Hare had joined us, and 2 guides had come up to the kitchen, and we just watched this thing hovering.
What did you think it was when you first saw it coming towards you? What was your first impression of it?
I thought it was an aircraft out of control, and I thought that it was going to land on the campsite.
We were very frightened.
Yes, we really did. We were very frightened. We didn't hear it coming at all. We just heard this terrific roar, looked up, and there it was.
And what impression did you get over in the meadow? What shape did it appear to be then, when you could have a good look at it?
It seemed to be a circular shape. We didn't see it all round it. We just saw the one side of it. And we just saw lights.
You got the impression that it was round, though, did you?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, it hadn't got any wings at all. It wasn't an aeroplane, I'm sure of that.
Did anyone try to go and have another look at it, a closer look at it?
Miss Hare wanted to go, and Mrs. McGowan was terrified, and I was frightened as well. But she would have gone if somebody had gone with her, but we were just scared. She did go to the manor to try and phone, but everybody was asleep, and we didn't want to disturb them, because Lady Sands lived in the manor on her own. We didn't want to frighten her, and we just couldn't get in touch with anyone else.
What did you think it was?
Well, it wasn't an aeroplane. Definitely wasn't an aeroplane. And it was either something from outer space or it was something that they're developing. You know, that's hush-hush they don't want us to know about.
And how high above the ground was it hovering?
Well, when it was coming over us, it wasn't very high at all. It was about house high. But when it was in the field, it was quite close to the ground. I should say about 30 feet off the ground, not more than that.
Do you think you're an imaginative woman? And have you ever thought about flying saucers before now?
Well, no. We just haven't thought about them. I always said that if I saw one, I would believe in them, and until I did see one, I wouldn't. And I'm convinced that we saw something. There was definitely something there.
In the winter of 1967, a no-nonsense Missouri farmer had what he believed to be a run-in with small, scurrying entities not from this world. This is the story of the Septembryo space penguins.
Greetings. You have been granted top secret access to the following content. It is for your ears and eyes only. Thank you for your cooperation.
On a bone-chilling morning of February 14th, 1967, 64-year-old farmer Claude Edwards woke up to attend to his duties on a remote parcel of land near Septembryo in Missouri. As the sun slowly began to rise, Edwards bundled up to face the bitter day, never imagining that he was about to have a face-to-face encounter with the unknown. Edwards was simple, hardworking, one of those salt-of-the-earth Midwesterners who had no time for any kind of foolishness regarding aliens, flying saucers, or anything like that. So as his worn boots tramped across the icy, rock-strewn slope that took him from his home to his barn, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. There, sitting in a nearby field, was a UFO. Edwards stated that before he saw the object, the first thing he noticed was that all of his cattle seemed to be gazing in the same direction as where this object was. Intrigued, Edwards followed their stares through a grove of trees and was astounded to see what he described as a massive grayish-green mushroom-like object, which was perched atop a circular tube in the meadow adjacent to his barn. Almost as if on autopilot, the farmer continued to the barn, his eyes never leaving the object. He set down his feed bucket and latched the door shut. With his barn secured, Edwards then turned back toward the object, and that's when he saw something he would never forget. A group of tiny, strange creatures hastily swarming beneath the object. Edwards estimated that he was separated from the entities by about 70 feet of land, 2 wire fences, and a smattering of cows. This courageous farmer was not pleased by the fact that his cows were being spooked or that his property was being trespassed on, even if the trespassers happened to be from out of this world. Edwards, no doubt fueled by a combination of curiosity and adrenaline, climbed the first gate and started walking towards the entities. As he reached the second gate, the creatures began moving in an even more agitated fashion. Edwards would later describe these creatures as being approximately 3 feet in height and having a grayish-green complexion, much like their ship, although it would seem that these beings erred on the greenish side more than anything. Also, it would seem that either these beings had no hands or that their arms were moving too swiftly, because Edwards couldn't discern the shape of their appendages. He also claimed that these creatures were either wearing goggles or had large, wide-set black eyes. They also had dark protuberances where their noses and mouths should have been. Whether or not he believed the protrusion to be a natural part of their physical features or some sort of protective apparatus is not clear. Edwards watched in wonder as these bizarre creatures buzzed back and forth directly beneath the object, arms swinging frantically at their sides. He would later claim that these invaders resembled little green penguins. He also stated that he could not clearly discern what manner of locomotion they were employing with their lower extremities. At this point, like any farmer defending their property, he picked up a pair of bulky rocks and approached what, at this point, he was convinced was a UFO. In fact, Edwards would later state that his intention was to use the rocks to throw at the UFO and puncture holes in its side in order to prevent it from taking off. As he got within 15 feet of the mushroom and the entities, he was abruptly stopped by some sort of force field. He claimed he could neither see nor tangibly feel it, but that the pressure the invisible barrier emitted was unmistakable. According to Edwards,
I thought I was going right up to it. I got up there and there it was. I just walked up against a wall.
It was then that Edwards got his first good look at the soundless, glinting vessel. He would later describe the metallic surface of the vehicle as being smooth and seamless, even going so far as to compare it to a shiny silk. He estimated that the curved top of the craft was about 18 feet in diameter and nearly 8 feet at its apex. The stem-like tube that was supporting the object was evidently made of the same material as the domed top and stood not much higher than the beings beneath it. At this point, the perplexed farmer could also discern evenly spaced oval portals about 12 inches long and 12 inches apart, situated around the lower rim of this mushroom-shaped saucer. Edwards would insist that these portals did not seem to function as windows, as he could see a dazzling array of colors radiating from each of the ovals. The colored lights oscillated as if they were spinning behind the portals. Edwards described the craft.
The object, it just looked like a big shell, and underneath there were oblong holes where the lights were coming out. They were so bright you couldn't see when you got up there, as if a color wheel was turning inside the thing.
Anxiously, Edwards backed off about 10 feet, wound up, and hurled one of the rocks at the object. The rock bounced off, noiselessly, and landed on the ground. But Edwards wasn't giving up. He picked up the second rock, and with even more force, he threw it. But this rock just skipped over the object like a stone over water before landing in the field behind the object. As soon as he lobbed the second stone, the scuttling little space aliens swiftly disappeared behind the craft, presumably into some sort of access portal. It was then that the strange craft tilted toward him not once, but twice. On the third lurch, the UFO then began to silently ascend off the ground. According to Edwards, the flying mushroom soared skyward at tremendous speed before it leveled off and began heading towards St. Elizabeth, which was located northeast of Tuscumbia. The UFO vanished within moments, leaving behind a puzzled farmer and a pasture full of befuddled bovines. Edwards later encapsulated his fantastic encounter for UFO investigator Ted Phillips.
The whole thing took over 5 minutes, maybe 10. I have never seen anything like it.
One detail that would add credibility to all of this was that Edwards was just a farmer, and he stood very little to gain, except ridicule from his peers, by admitting to this potentially harrowing event. In fact, when Phillips was introduced to Edwards through his brother, the farmer refused to utter a word about the incident until Phillips pledged to protect the farmer's anonymity, which he did until Edwards' death. Phillips described his first encounter with Edwards.
When I arrived at the farm, we visited for several minutes, gaining his confidence that I wouldn't reveal his name or location until his death. He didn't like talking about the sighting at first, but became more comfortable as we discussed the weather and farming. I asked him to relive the event in real time, and we began on his front porch, which faces the large barn near the landing area.
The fact that Edwards never tried to squeeze an ounce of publicity or profit out of this incident would lead many investigators to conclude that he was being nothing but honest. In further support of Edwards' claims is the uncanny trace evidence left behind in the field where the UFO had landed. Phillips, who arrived to interview Edwards not long after the events in question, was able to photograph the effects this UFO had on the field, including the spot where the support tube had met the soil. Phillips explained the following.
When I arrived at the site, traces were still quite visible. It was 1 meter in diameter in a slightly irregular circle where the shaft had rested. The soil was extremely dehydrated, contrasted with the surrounding soil.
This would be the first and last encounter that Edwards ever reported with the strange mushroom craft and the space penguins. But it could be a safe bet that when he stepped out of his modest home at the crack of dawn to begin his work every morning thereafter, that he never did so without looking out into that field with some apprehension, and perhaps just a bit of anticipation of if the Tuscumbia space penguins would ever return.